just like
You can answer this.
well, already recording, so watch out, Ricky. We don't want to.
You can also answer in the chat, Ricky, if you don't want to. If you've got a lot of noise going on.
Yeah, it's all right. Hey, Ricky, we're gonna go ahead and start, so you can talk to Professor Tootle in a little bit.
Yeah.
So you're already recording, right, Tony? Okay. So Professor Tootle, thanks so much for joining us today for a discussion on something that's on every single one of our minds as Americans, and it's what's going on in Afghanistan. And for about a half a day, I don't think it made it a full day. Hold on, we got to get a couple more people in here. And Colonel Rice is joining us. For about a half a day, I kind of thought Americans were united. Watching what was going on at the airport, it was just so traumatic. It's one of those, memories going to be driven into my brain. So originally, when I suggested the topic of this week, I suggested that we talk about have Americans lost the ability to persuade each other? It seems like we just kind of rant to our own team and kind of disparage the other team. And it doesn't seem like we're even trying to persuade each other as Americans. It seems like we just kind of spout out stuff and then look for an angry retort or something. And then I said, or we can talk about Afghanistan. And you said, let's talk about Afghanistan. And so I do have a hidden agenda on this one. Usually I don't think I have a hidden agenda. It's to figure out whether our fellow Americans are our enemy or whether there's real enemies out there. And maybe using Afghanistan as an example of what it means to be an American and how we relate to other countries. Or I'm not even sure Afghanistan is a country, but you'll correct me if you think it is. So that's kind of the tone and tenor that I'm looking for out of this conversation. Why don't you tell me why you said Afghanistan, then we'll go into a quick bio, then we'll go into my question. So why did you say Afghanistan rather than what it means to be an American, and why do we hate each other so much?
Well, I just thought it was the most topical thing we could discuss, and it's we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of September 11th, and I thought it was a more appropriate thing for me to comment on. In fact, Professor Garlitz, who is here with us, we were, I believe, both at Ohio University on September 11th. Were you there, or Ricky? No, you weren't there yet. You came the next year. So I went on September 11th. I was a teaching assistant for a diplomatic historian. So I went with him into the classroom, and he was the one who informed the classroom of the attack, and we watched the falling of the Twin Towers together. That was with a historian by the name of Chester Patch. That's who I witnessed the events of that day with. So in a way, it felt more appropriate to address this thing that has at least now 20-year history in this format. So that's why I chose the topic.
And so, but you're not just a guy. So we'll get into our bios here in a second, because Tony's a guy, and Maria I know well is a guy. In fact, Joe's a guy. Jeremy's a guy. There's all sorts of people out there, but you have a unique perspective on current events because you're a historian who specializes in some things. So just my brief bio. I was 20 years ago, I was a county commissioner, and I was in the Army National Guard. In fact, my boss, Joe Rice, is Colonel. Sorry, sir. Was the mayor of Glendale, I think, at the time, and I was a county commissioner, so we knew each other in civilian world, and we also knew each other in politics. And I remember September 11th deeply. I was a county commissioner. I was chairman of the second largest airport in the United States, Centennial Airport. And we closed down the county that day, and I went over to the airport, and there was some crazy American citizen trying to storm the airport tower, the FAA tower. I mean, it was a weird time. And I thought we should be in Afghanistan because if you hurt America so directly and you harbor terrorists and you're involved in it, I was all in on that war. So there was no issue with that. Did I know much about Afghanistan then, or do I know much about it now? And the answer is no. And I think I'm probably fairly stereotypical of most Americans. But I'm not the historian. I'm just the facilitator of this discussion. you're the historian. But why don't you talk about your background just a little bit, Professor? Then we'll get into the Q&A.
My professional training is in history. My first field is in modern U.S. political history. Second field was in U.S. intellectual history, and then I have minor fields in Soviet history and European intellectual history. Taught at the University of Northern Colorado, Georgia State, before moving back to my hometown, where I've been teaching at the College of Sequoias since 2007. And I write and comment on matters involving history and politics for many outlets, but I was also involved in politics at the local level too. So that's my short bio. And
we both met at the American Enterprise Institute. It will tie into today's conversation because the former CEO, Arthur Brooks, said his lifelong mission is to eliminate poverty. That we've done the capitalism, or in your words, peace, has done a good job of that over the last few decades, but he doesn't think we're done yet, and we have a moral obligation to help people in need. And I just think that's fascinating for a conservative think tank to have a CEO that says that kind of thing. But you and I have a similar vein in that on how we should be doing better in politics and community and engagement and thought. Any reflections on that before we get directly into Afghanistan?
Only so insofar as that, Afghanistan is one of those places that's almost a test case for what happens when you have the absence of peace, when you have the absence of rule of law, that arbitrary power fills that vacuum, and human beings retreat into the things that human beings have always retreated into in the absence of rule of law.
And that's their familial tribal power structure for safety and security. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Colonel Rice, before we get too far into this, I think you were Iraq veteran many times, not Afghanistan. Is that correct? Or
yes, 3 years, okay. 5 times in Iraq, but have not been to Afghanistan.
Okay, similar, but different. Any other veterans in the crowd that have been to Afghanistan? I don't see any offhand. Okay, Professor, so when I did my extensive research that you would give me a D- in your class for, I checked out Wikipedia. I know everything about Wikipedia that a hour will tell me. And I don't think we need to talk about Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan, but it is no doubt Afghanistan and its people, maybe not Afghanistan, have been around a long time. I mean, thousands of years, at least what the wiki says. Is there any deep history that we need to know about Afghanistan versus the United States? Is there anything that set the tone hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, or at our founding of the country versus the founding of Afghanistan after the British left? Is there any historical context that is useful for us?
Well, I think, in big terms, absolutely. The fact that its location as on the Silk Road, between the Chinese, Iran, and Russia, and its history being influenced by being at this kind of crossroads, but also the geography of it being so incredibly rugged, and then the sort of tribal nature of the people who have been there for so long. Afghanistan, kind of, even the word means, people who live here, so there's this constant. It's a crossroads between, in many ways, the furthest extent of Western influence. Alexander, Kandahar, that's one of the cities named after Alexander the Great, but it was never able. It was always a sort of pawn between Iran, China, and Russia, but the ruggedness of the terrain meant that, and landlocked, so there wasn't sort of a natural port or that could serve as a kind of natural place for cities to develop, other than as a crossroads of trading routes. So that's where the major cities are.
So going all the way up into the 20th century, did America care about Afghanistan per se? I mean, did we have the strength or wealth or desire to have any interest in that part of the world when the British left?
Not really. I guess trying to think of the first when it came on America's radar at all. I guess probably the first time would be in a little bit in World War II. You kind of had to worry about it a bit, and then immediately in the years after World War II in a kind of Cold War context. But again, more or less satisfied with the status quo up until the 70s, really, because there were a series of revolutions in Afghanistan. The first was a kind of right-wing coup, and the second was a kind of left-wing coup. But we were more or less satisfied with that. And so it really doesn't appear on the American radar until the Soviets, and again, a kind of Cold War context of everything else that was going on with the Carter administration. The Soviets, it looked like the left-wing pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan was going to collapse, and they decided to invade. And the Carter administration really went all in. Carter was extremely reactionary in his response to the Soviet invasion. It wasn't part of a grand strategy that he had when he entered office. So he had a kind of almost a kitchen sink approach towards Afghanistan right there towards the end of his presidency. And then, of course, that's the situation that the Reagan administration inherited. Much has been made of the Reagan intervention into Afghanistan. There's the book Charlie Wilson's War and the movie, if people are familiar with it.
Terrific movie, by the way. If you haven't seen Charlie Wilson's War, it is a quirky, odd little snippet in American history that is really worth watching. I don't know if it's historically accurate, Professor. It is an entertaining movie, though.
Yeah, and the book is good and the movie's good, and they're both accurate insofar as they are describing a story that is a little bit compressed for time. So it's like many movies. It's accurate, but if you don't put it in a broader context, it might compress some timelines for you and give you maybe the wrong impression. Maybe the most important of those being that even the Reagan administration wasn't going all in Afghanistan until pretty late in his term, and we didn't know this at the time, but the Soviets had already pretty much decided that they were going to withdraw by that time. So, there's less of a causal relationship between those late aggressive actions and the Soviet withdrawal, because Gorbachev, it turns out, had already decided to withdraw. So, but we had supported it, in the way we often do, the people who were opposed to Soviet power. And by that time, Afghanistan had been an Islamic country for 1,000 years. So Islam is also factoring in there by the 1980s.
So Professor, to have such one of the most profound experiences just this week about what it means to be an American and what freedom may mean and what other people want to escape to freedom and I don't think I'm being too dramatic that this is a really important week in American history, but maybe you'll correct me. But I want to keep going back for a second. You're telling me that the entire history of what used to be Afghanistan and America since 1776, we really didn't care much about each other until our lifetimes, right? Until me 60s, you early 70s, until our lifetimes. And it was really only when we're fighting the Cold War from capitalism against communism, America versus USSR. That's when Afghanistan first mattered to America. Is that mostly accurate?
Well, for almost all of American history, well, I guess I need to revise this as I get older, but for most of American history, American foreign policy was based on a combination of ideals and interests. So whatever our policy was, it had to be keeping it within our ideals, and it had to be in keeping with our interests. It isn't until the Wilson administration that Woodrow Wilson posits that we should have a foreign policy based only on the ideals of the president. Franklin Roosevelt and subsequent presidents try to reverse that somewhat, but this idea that we would be involved everywhere in the world or care about everything in the world, it really only becomes a subject of debate in the 20th century. So post World War II, so much of it is really decided by presidents, much more so than, if the president has a strategic vision and then lets the events of the day encounter that strategic vision, then we tend to not have reactionary presidents. But if presidents come into office without a coherent strategic vision for American foreign policy, what we tend to get are reactionary presidents who kind of just react to events, and then we have to sort of hope that they're bright or they're smart or they're good people, and hopefully things work out. But what it means is that you sometimes have a coherent foreign policy and sometimes you don't.
So you answered my question in a different way, which was better. But up until the USSR versus America, freedom versus communism, we didn't care about Afghanistan, correct?
Well, I shouldn't say. World War I was when we began having political positions on the rights of all nations in a universal sense. That's the only sort of caveat. We didn't care about, we cared about Afghanistan in that sense because it was a country that had interests, but in real terms, so there's an ideological answer or a philosophical answer or a legal answer versus the reality, which is we really only start to care about or believing. I mean, even the idea that security interests are that our security interests are intertwined with the foreign policies of other nations in a sort of permanent way. That doesn't come about until after World War II. So, and it's a subject of debate, but it's probably part of the foreign policy consensus that comes out of World War II, that we have a security interest in the prosperity and security of every nation on earth.
So do you think this is too much of a stretch? And I'm hesitant to go too far down here, but if you can just kind of give some reaction. As you know, I just finished Freedom National versus Freedom Slavery, and the role of the U.S. Constitution versus states' rights, and the role of the colonies and how it led to the Civil War. Is that analogy conceivably possible on how America treats freedom internally versus how we view freedom in other countries and our role? Does that have any play with what's going on in Afghanistan today?
Yes, but with the caveat that Americans tend to vote for president based on domestic issues, which they should not do, because in domestic issues, presidents have to deal with Congress. foreign policy is one of the few areas where the president really has almost carte blanche. There are limitations with how treaties have to be handled and what can become established law and war. But aside from a handful of limitations, the foreign policy of the United States is under the direction of the President of the United States. So, but very few Americans vote for president based on any foreign policy consideration. So, with the last 30 years of identity politics dominating all political discussions, foreign policy discussions just completely go by the wayside.
True. But my point by that, though, is that we as Americans really haven't determined whether we think freedom is a universal truth or just applies to Americans.
No.
And we haven't quite resolved that, have we, in our role in foreign policy?
Well, I would just say that most people never resolve the internal contradiction of their belief system. So if you were to ask somebody who's walking down the street, do you believe that everyone is entitled to human rights? They would all answer yes. But then if you were to ask a sort of like lefty person, like, do you believe that women should have rights? And they'll say yes. But then when you say, like, should we intervene in countries on the other side of the world where we have no security interests in order to secure women's rights? And are you willing to die for this? Are you willing to kill for it? Once you start adding a cost to a belief system, that's just an internal contradiction most people don't contemplate, are the potential costs of what it would mean to advocate for these things. Yeah. In other words, the same person who would say that it's wrong to abuse women will do nothing, will still have an iPhone made in China, they'll, I haven't checked to see where my clothes are made, but, we still engage in these trade and commercial relationships with regimes that are engaged in terrible things. How many people who smoke marijuana really support what drug cartels do? Like, unless you are going to a place that grows their own, you might be supporting and that's the other, I guess, other thing about Afghanistan that we haven't mentioned is that it's also a narco state. The poppies grow there, and that's where heroin comes from. So, like many places, on Earth, there is a drug component of the story that drives many of the political considerations. We often talk about how Venezuela is a socialist country, but really it's a drug state. They have all these generals that are all being bribed with drug money. In Afghanistan, it's the same issue. The thing that funds the behavior is poppies, opium.
I'm glad you brought that up. I wasn't going to bring that up, but I'm glad you have that nuance. One quick snippet: when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we went, hooray, it's going to be a quagmire. This is impossible to win. It's going to cost them a ton of money. It's going to weaken the Soviet Union. We'll help fund the Mujahideen in a kind of a private war, secret war, whatever. Yay, now we're interested in Afghanistan because we believe in freedom, and they're a communist dictatorial society, and we hate Russians, so let's support the insurgency. Correct?
Well, not really. I mean, if the we is the Carter administration, it wasn't yay, it was how dare they, because it undermines so many of the things that Carter was trying to do in foreign policy at the time. And so he definitely did not celebrate when it took place. He was furious. And
sure.
And within the Reagan administration, that's where you get the first sort of ideas that this could be something that could harm the Soviet Union over the long term. I mean, and it did demonstrate these. I mean, it's sort of crazy to think about. If you think about what it demonstrated to people within the Soviet Union, for instance, during the Soviet war with Afghanistan, they could never keep more than 100,000 troops supplied in a region that was on their border. So that would be like the United States not being able to support an invasion of Mexico with 100,000 soldiers, you know. And so what it told our analysts, at least some of them within the Reagan administration, is that was some of the first inkling that the Soviet Union was brittle and weak, was that they could not accomplish this. So when we think about the analogy between Vietnam and Afghanistan, which people bring up all the time, one of the things that scared the Soviets was how many soldiers we could keep resupplied on the other side of the world, because they knew that they couldn't keep 600,000 soldiers resupplied in Vietnam. And that proved to be true because they couldn't keep 100,000 soldiers resupplied on their own border. And so that was one of the things that led the military within the Soviet Union and their own diplomatic corps to understand that some sort of reform of Soviet communism had to take place because of their inability to just do the basics of fighting a war on their own border.
Okay, and Professor, we're almost ready for questions, but I really want to squeeze this one in before we open it up. So we're skipping a bunch until September 11th, and September 11th, we just had to go to Afghanistan, period. We weren't positive that that was the absolutely right thing to do, but yeah, we just had to do it. Not unanimously. I think there was one person of Congress who decided no, but everybody else, including American citizens, including me, we all had to go to Afghanistan, correct?
Well, I would just say that there were people who did object to the war in Afghanistan. And yes, when it came down to a vote in Congress, but I remember right after September 11th, I was slated to go watch this historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., speak. And, it was scheduled beforehand. And so when the speech took place, but he was opposed to the military action in Afghanistan. And that was, so there were intellectuals certainly at the time that opposed the invasion of Afghanistan. So,
but very few. Thanks for pointing that out. Very few. Hopefully you can hear me right now. It looks like I'm unstable. The connection's unstable, not me unstable. So it's our longest serving war. Yeah, I know. It's our longest war in the history of the United States. Give us a reflection on all the way up to this week. What are the lessons that we should be thinking?
Oh, I lost you right at the end of the question. Can you repeat your question? John, I didn't hear the question. Oh, you're muted. Or I can't hear you. Got no audio.
Yeah, we all lost him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, now he is muted. Can you unmute yourself and try again?
Did you hear the full question or just part of the question, Professor?
None of it.
Sorry. Taking us all the way up to this week, from a historian's perspective, what should Americans really be thinking about regarding what's going on in Afghanistan now? Right, we have some unified opinion that we just don't like innocents being hurt, but then we start to divide right away. This or that, this team versus that. Is there something that you would like to pitch us to say before you just post and rant against the other side? Can you add some maturity or some historical perspective of where we are as America and what we should be thinking about in our relationship in the world, with Afghanistan as the example?
It's funny when you ask a question that big. The only thing I could think of is that there is a tremendous political, diplomatic, and security cost to not electing politicians who are wise and experienced. President Obama was bright and a good human being, but he had been a state senator for 18 months before then joining the United States Senate for about 6 months before campaigning for president. And being bright is good, and being a good person is good, but it is no substitute for thinking systematically about these issues in a deep and profound way. I would say the same holds true for both President Trump as well. And at least with, the joke about President Biden is that he's thought about this stuff for a long time, but he's been wrong about everything. But at least there is a coherence to his policy. That's not to defend every action and every statement taken by his underlings, but at least there is a coherence to his position that has been consistent. And it's not my position, but at least I understand it, which is he opposed the surge when he was the vice president of the United States under President Obama. And he had decided that we were going to get out of Afghanistan, and that it wasn't worth a single American life. And that is the policy he has pursued for probably close to 20 years now. So again, it's not my policy, but at least we have what I would consider to be a conventionally bad American foreign policy. It is bad on a recognizable scale.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Professor, I do want to have one more quick question. There is one unique thing that America stands for that is almost unique in the world, maybe totally unique. What is it? What is the American foreign policy? What do we stand for?
Well, I don't know. The unique thing is probably American exceptionalism. The idea that we have a specific role to play in the history of the world to be an example that representative government works. That now many other countries would also serve as an example, but that we have a special burden to preserve representative government and serve as an example for the rest of the world. I think that was the answer you're probably going for in terms of foreign policy. Yeah,
because it's not talked about much, but it ties into Afghanistan and why we point fingers at each other, but it's not talked about, and I think we should talk about it more. But that's you can all ask your own questions now. I've asked my variety of questions of the professor. Joe, or Mayor, Representative, Colonel. Joe, you get the first stab, followed by David Randall, if you're willing. And then anyone that would like to ask a question, please get ready to jump in. Colonel Rice.
Yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate your comments, Stephen and John, for doing this. I'll stick with the question I put in the chat there about Tom Ricks's, I'm sorry, not Tom Ricks's, about Dominic Turney's book. Tom Ricks is another good book we're chatting about in the chat there. But his book on how we fight, the American Way of War, Crusades and Quagmires. Have you read it? Are you familiar with it? And what do you think of his premise?
I haven't read that book, but I read Fiasco.
Fiasco by Ricks, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think I would almost defer to Ricky and our friend Tom. Politicians should be, that we shouldn't confuse strategy with tactics. And we have civilian control of the military. So many of the criticisms that Ricks makes are almost, at least this is my impression, not having read the books that you directly mentioned, but because he writes on policy all the time. But sometimes I get the impression with him that he's making complaints or observations that are a consequence of the chaos, the inevitable chaos of having civilian control of the military. I don't know if that's a fair criticism of those books that you mentioned, but it's something that we should almost expect in our system. I don't know.
I would be curious at some point if you ever would check out Dominic Turney's book. I think it's a fascinating theory as I am interpreting it and remembering it, but it dealt a lot with institution building, and it kind of deals to the other thing in the chat there, that we, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we interfered enough to upset the current system, but we didn't interfere enough to really develop a new system and call it nation building, other things. I think, I would argue, and I know they're vastly different cultures, but nation building efforts in Bosnia and what I would call institution building steps we put in place in Bosnia would have worked very well in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we didn't do them. So at some point, if you check out the book and ever want to talk about it or to do another one of these, I'd be fascinated in your thoughts on it.
Well, I guess I can comment on that theory. My basic position is that you can set the stage for the development of a political culture that protects rights, but you can't actually make it happen. And my position in foreign policy is similar to my position in domestic policy. We can set the stage, but or to put it another way, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. So the United States can provide a place that is peaceful, and they can provide for the possibility of the development of a free political culture. But what they cannot do is create the political culture in that place. And in particular, they can't do it when violence is present. Because the same thing, I mean, not every analogy between Saigon and Kabul are appropriate, but this is appropriate for the end of every war. No soldier wants to be the last soldier to die in a losing war, because you have to be a real true believer or a maniac, or you have to almost believe in committing suicide, right? In order to do that, and that's just not how human beings are. And so, really, once President Obama indicated that we were going to withdraw no matter what, and once the Taliban gave its assurance that they would not interfere with our withdrawal, they realized that it was in their own security interest to not harm Americans for this period of time. And thus, Americans haven't been dying in Afghanistan, right? Once that was set into place, everybody began making their arrangements for a post-American world in Afghanistan, knowing that when the Americans leave, the Taliban will be willing to use violence to enforce their will. And there was almost no point in fighting. The interesting thing to me would be, and this might be the only sort of wrinkle, is half the people in that country live in the city. And almost half live in one city. And it will be interesting to see if the people who have lived in that city, in Kabul, who have been experiencing a level of freedom and peace now for 20 years, if there are enough of them with a concentrated enough population that they could effectively resist the imposed political culture from the Taliban. But I never underestimate how effective violence is at modifying human behavior.
Or even threat of violence.
Or even the threat of violence, yeah. So I would just say, I don't know, but that's the only wrinkle.
So Professor, excuse me for a point of personal privilege. Joe, I know all those other titles you have, but I'm saying Joe intentionally because the human beingness, the eye to eye, the handshake, the hug, the sharing of a meal with each other is one of the most basic of human traits. I'm giving you a point of personal privilege of how we should treat interpreters and other people in Afghanistan or Iraq. But will you just make your point that I echoed on a couple days ago? Whatever privilege you'd like on how we should treat people that allied with ourselves, with Americans.
Well, for all sorts of moral reasons, as well as if you ever want the United States to be trusted again, wherever we go and allies we make, yeah, we have to assist them. And this is where I a lot of times come back and blame we the people. And it's hard to say how one person, but I think enough of us can get involved and do one little, it's the starfish thing, save one starfish, right? And in this case, everybody who's ranting, I think we can all agree on, let's help these folks. So there's refugee agencies that are starved for money and more volunteers. And I know many people here have been involved in hosting refugees over. It's a lot easier than you think it is. It doesn't require, you don't have to sign up for a legal commitment. But if you just either donate some money, donate some furniture, but there are all these refugees that come over all the time. Now we're going to get a big flux of them, and I think we ought to support that. And somebody to befriend them and show them how to fill out an application and how to use the bus system and all those kinds of things. If we really want to, blame the Biden or Trump administration or both for things that have happened, blame yourself unless you get involved as well.
Yeah, and Joe, I hired an acquaintance or friend of yours in my past for that very reason. And I'm telling you, I think it's one of the most rewarding things to actually just care for another human being that truly needs our help. I mean, you're in a foreign country that don't speak the language and don't know the culture, and another human being reaches out to you, and it's one of the more rewarding things I've done in my past because of you, Joe. So thank you, and I hope other people listen to it. So thank you. Okay, David, I offered to give it to you since you're a new acquaintance and served in, I think, Iraq as well, not Afghanistan. Do you have a question, David?
I'm just sitting here enjoying some of this conversation. I will say that as a Democrat, this conversation has seemed more to the right than I would have anticipated into the beginning, to include the terminologies that you're using just simply around words like freedom, or just how the rest of the world would consider America's idea of freedom. Also to include the use of American exceptionalism as a positive understanding of America. I believe it's just been very intriguing to hear the perception of what I assume you guys are right-leaning on the position of Afghanistan and U.S. relations with Afghanistan specifically.
Yeah, the professor wouldn't agree with right-leaning. He lectures me on all that all the time, but we're both conservatives. And so thank you for inclining to that. Professor, do you have a reaction to, and you can watch one of our previous videos on that, David, but it's interesting to see that you picked up on that. So I appreciate your comments. Professor.
No, just if he has a specific question,
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Maybe here's where I'll ask your question. In which ways has America contributed to the downfall of Afghanistan since the 1970s?
Which ways has the United States contributed to the downfall of Afghanistan?
Since the 1970s, yeah. I'd just like your perspective. I'm not looking for specific answers, nor do I expect our positions to align in any way, but to have a better understanding of where you believe our mistakes have laid would be a good starting point, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, David.
I guess I would say it began with the overreaction of the Carter administration. I don't know that the initial response by the Reagan administration was necessarily contributed to the downfall of Afghanistan, because in both cases we were responding to things that were going on in Iran, China, and the Soviet Union. So to have simply washed our hands of it might mean that we were, we could have avoided being blamed for what happened in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, even in the 60s, America had taken away a democratically elected leader in Iran. And that was part of the problem in the Middle East, all the way going back to essentially America's support of the Balfour documents at Britain after World War I.
But I just don't know that that directly contributed to political instability in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, you did make reference that the country has been for 1,000 years Muslim. And that was one of the big controversies of America's support of Saudi Arabia and Israel after the Balfour documents. And one of the reasons why we went into Iran to take away the democratically elected leader there and install an American puppet.
But in this particular case, that didn't contribute to the political instability of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was always trying to establish itself as having a separate identity. And if anything, it's sort of, the opposite, where because of the American relationship with Iran, Afghanistan was freer to establish its own political identity with less intervention from the United States, but perhaps more intervention from China. I mean, in a way, like the real people who were trying to influence policy in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s were China and the Soviet Union. So I just don't know that, I don't know how those things would have, if anything, it led to the United States being less involved in Afghanistan, not more involved in Afghanistan.
Fair enough, David, or a quick follow-up?
I mean, yeah, I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to get a, general understanding of where he thought America's downfalls were with the Afghanistan conflict.
And David, despite both the professor and I being conservative leaning, you're the target market for us, by the way. So thank you so much for joining us so we can have thoughtful discussions with each other. So thank you, Professor.
Very, very important for us to have dialogue between both sides.
And I would just open this up to Ricky to see if I said anything that was wrong that you heard, or you can just give me a thumbs up if I did okay, or did I say anything incorrect there?
Actually, could I ask you a question,
Sure.
Dr. Strudel? This question has more to do with the future than history. So it's more of these, where do we go from here? I suspect that what we're likely to see emerging with regard to Afghanistan in the coming years is more a kind of containment policy, but one that will be different from what we saw in the Cold War, because the world's changed a lot, and the component of international terrorism is so important right now. Do you think that the policy we will see going forward might look similar to the way the U.S. government deals with Iran? And if so, is that a bit, is there a source of concern there? Because it seems to me that the way the U.S. government handles Iran has had limited effectiveness it's been very effective in undermining Iran's economy, but not particularly effective in undermining Iran's ability to support Shia militant groups around the Middle East. So I don't know. What do you see? I guess the question is, what do you see happening now?
Well, I think if I'm being optimistic, I think you're correct that there are policy experts who are already trying to, game out this scenario. People have been advocating for a long time, beefing up, for instance, our naval capacity to deal with both the threat coming out of China, South China Sea, India, Afghanistan, Iran. In other words, we need a more robust Navy and Air Force, but in particular, a more robust naval presence in the Pacific and in the Indian Oceans. But in addition to that, I think some of this, we sometimes fall into this trap of believing that we can control these events. I think one of the other things that's a real that has real potential here is more intervention from the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese, because that's what they've done before. And so a lot of it depends on will the Iranians, for instance, use this as they have in the past, an attempt to move in and begin trying to influence Afghanistan. Then do the Chinese and the Russians, how do they react to that? Or for instance, I guess I could kind of say, this is all just a guess, but like if I was to guess, I think that the Russians and the Chinese would probably be the ones who were responding to something that Iran was doing, and I could see that happening. I hope so. I know that there are policy experts who are at least trying to cope with this as a potential in the future. I think a lot of it depends on our political leadership over the next few election cycles. Do we have Captain Caveman in office, or do we have somebody who puts together a policy planning staff that with a coherent set of policy guidelines based on reality, because as Eisenhower used to say, planning is essential, but once the fighting starts, you throw the plans out the window. But you have to.
That was Mike Tyson that said that.
Maybe. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, maybe Mike Tyson said it too. But I don't know. That's my guess.
Okay. Brian, I'm hesitant to call on you because you always ask such deep, introspective, big questions. But do you have one that won't take the rest of the hour?
I do. Thanks for the rundown on what's going on here. Is there anything that we can learn from the British with respect to how they handled counterinsurgency? Because after all, they were pretty good in the 20th century, but one could argue that they had experience going back to, say, 1776-ish.
Well, we can always learn from the experiences of others. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be a historian. So the short answer is yes. I think that one of the things that the British have been particularly good at is grasping reality. Now, sometimes we get angry with them because it seems like it takes them 5 years, but they, because of their experience, their long history of encountering so many areas of the world over the past few hundred years, they do have a broad experience, and I think do tend to have a diplomatic corps that can look at a situation and say, I think this is where it's going to end up. We might not want it to end up there, but this is where it's going to end up. How can we grasp that reality a little bit quicker? I think that's maybe the most important, I'd say, lesson. The British do tend to, and actually this is a strange failing in America, but there's very little institutional knowledge in the American diplomatic corps, because it's very strange that they don't have any systems for learning the way that the military does, for instance. Mm-hmm. The military will study, and after something happens, they will record it, study it, put it into a manual, and it'll be used as soon as possible. There's nothing like that in the State Department. Not really. And I always thought that was a strange failing in our how we've conducted foreign policy. It's just not enough institutional knowledge, and so much so that people will point out, as I have friends who've filtered through the State Department, they'll kind of point out that often we're negotiating with the same people and they're doing the same thing they did 10 years ago, and we just have no idea that that these are the same people who broke their word 10 years ago. And I'll say, like, shouldn't somebody have checked to see, you know, like, so I think that's probably one of the largest points of comparison and a failing that we have.
Gotcha.
I was just listening to a session by a Army historian, Robert Mackey, and he had a very simple observation that if you can't keep the supplies running in, that you have no bit, you will not be able to stop an insurgency. That's it.
Seems to be, yeah.
Yeah, cool. We are almost out of time, so let's go into rapid fire questions if there are any left. Maria, do you have one? Jason, I know you've typed a bunch. Barb, or Barb's husband, Jeremy. Last call for questions.
I just have a real quick question, and Stephen, you touched on this a little bit earlier. There have been a lot of analogies made between what happened in Afghanistan over the weekend and the fall of Saigon and those kinds of comparisons. Are there deeper analogies that we need to draw, or that we should draw, from an overall policy in Vietnam to an overall policy in Afghanistan? Or are they just two separate things?
I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about is the failure of public leadership, in so far as having how much we have suffered over the past 15-ish years from, in some cases, the government, but in other cases, elite institutions like the media or education, from communicating a coherent set of policy decisions, including the costs of these policy decisions, because that's complicated and it requires time, and you have to say this, and it requires coherence. And I remember being frustrated during the second Bush administration, well, also the first Bush administration for that matter, at how often I would wish that somebody would just summarize what he was saying in the media. You know, like, can I just get something without an analysis? Because what is often missing when you immediately go to these counterpoint takes is you leave out, in your recitation of what your opponent has said, you leave out the part where they have described what the cost of this is going to be. Because when I go back now and I read speeches, as I have done in the past couple of days, speeches from the Bush administration, from the days right after September 11th, one of the things I'm struck by is all of the times when he is explaining how hard this is going to be and the costs that it's going to take, and I remember thinking that all of that just gets lost when our first impulse is to be a reactionary. You know, like it seems like the first thing you should be able to do. I think this is something that, like, I'm sure Lord Chesterton probably said something like this, but like the first obligation before you disagree with somebody is that you should be able to coherently explain their position. And then once you can do that, then you are allowed to disagree. So, you know.
Yeah, if you've ever been through marriage counseling, it's the same deal.
Yeah, I have. It didn't work. So, but
same.
Yeah. So, but it's true that I mean, yes, I'm a conservative, but I studied liberalism. You know, I didn't study, I studied liberalism under liberals because I wanted to make sure that I understood liberalism. I think that the first obligation of any news organization or elite institution is to first tell me what Joe Biden's saying. First make sure that I can clearly outline Joe Biden's position and then tell you why maybe it's a mistake. But we have to do the first part in order for any of our discussions to be productive.
Excellent. Excellent. We are over time. Last call for a question.
Hey, this is Tony. I'd like to ask a question. Can you hear me okay?
You're good.
All right. So, Stephen, Professor Tootle, thank you as always. My question is, can you get in front of or explain what I'm hearing is a narrative that says we removed the Taliban several years ago, and now they're just taking their rightful place. So can you help me understand historically the accuracy of that, or refute that, or just give some information?
Say it again, that
So there was the Taliban were removed by a coup that was supported by us, the United States, through all kinds of covert mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Taliban is taking its rightful place, which is the way that it should have been. We should never have. I mean, basically what people are arguing is like, this was going to happen anyway. Why did we even get involved? So that's really.
I see. So again, it dates back to September 11th. So the logic behind the invasion of Afghanistan was after September 11th, we said to the world, we are no longer going to allow governments to harbor terrorists that are willing to engage in a, by the way, thank you, Professor Garlitz, for logging on. It's great to see you. That we're no longer willing to tolerate any government in the world that that will admit to harboring a terrorist organization that engages in a direct attack on the United States. So that was a requirement that we made for the whole world. And we just simply said, you are not allowed to harbor Al-Qaeda. And every nation on earth was forced to meet that requirement. And there were only 2 nations that refused. Well, I have 3, but
don't be unclear. Which ones?
Iraq and Afghanistan.
And 3?
Well, it's Iran actually did cooperate, believe it or not. It's sort of, and the other thing is like, you have to say like Pakistan pretended to, we couldn't, but at least officially, those countries cooperated with our demands to turn over everyone who was in Al-Qaeda. And there were only 2 countries that didn't, Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the doctrine was that you're not allowed to harbor Al-Qaeda. And the Taliban backed Al-Qaeda, and they did so after September 11th. And so that was why they were the target. I don't know, in order to, I have a hard time, you use the word rightful, and I would just say that, by my definition of rightful, a government that denies all basic human rights would never meet my definition of a rightful government, because they deny that all human beings are created equal and they're entitled to unalienable rights and stuff like that. But like the founders of the United States, I consider any government that denies human rights to be an illegitimate government. And certainly the Taliban is a government that denies basic human rights.
That help, Tony?
Yeah, that did. And at some later point, I'd like to hear what Saudi Arabia's role was in all this, and whether you count them as somebody that supported or didn't support terrorists, kind of thing.
Leave it to our producer to ask the hard-hitting questions right at the end. Go ahead, Professor.
Yes, they did help. and that, remember, the target of Al-Qaeda was Saudi Arabia. I mean, Osama bin Laden.
Why was it Saudi Arabia again?
What's that?
Why was it Saudi Arabia though?
Because Saudi Arabia had cooperated with the United States, and we had security forces in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War, and we had permanent bases in Saudi Arabia. And
Yeah, I mean, but bin Laden's hate for America goes back to the contracts in which his father had for drilling oil in Saudi Arabia in the 60s.
Yeah, perhaps, but I have to.
That's a fact though, sir.
But what I would say is when he was outlining the reasons why Al-Qaeda, the organization that he headed, was his specific criticism of the United States was the permanent presence of the American military in Saudi Arabia. And that was one of the reasons he gave for why the September 11th attacks had to take place.
And just to clarify, was Bill Clinton the first to demand that Al-Qaeda give over bin Laden?
Was Bill Clinton?
Yes.
The first to demand that they, well, he was certain. Yes.
I think he did it after the cruise missile attacks in 1998, and after bin Laden had said that he was the one who plotted the 2 attacks on the embassies in Africa in 1997, right?
Yes, that's right.
Cool. David, and thank you for your active engagement in this. Hope you come back to more of them. We are 8 minutes over already. So forgive me, unless there's just an absolute urgent question that I haven't seen, we're going to wrap this up for today. Professor Tootle, you and I are engaging in these, not for just idle because we want to hear each other talk. We have an agenda. And it's not a conservative agenda, although you and I happen to both be conservatives. I don't think it is it? Is it a conservative agenda that we're trying to accomplish?
I would hope not.
Right.
I think it's not giving liberals enough credit if you would say it's just a
right. And we wish people could understand where we're from and where we are and where we're going and why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And you have a unique role as a historian that I don't have. And so I appreciate your time. But I do have an agenda, and that is that we've got to be better Americans. We just have to be better at this. And I have no comprehension why we're not better at this. We have all the world's history, although I intentionally bring up Wikipedia. The next million sites after Google of Wikipedia is all these other sites on Afghanistan. I mean, the world's information is at my fingertips. All I do is have to read. But for some reason, we're not reading. We're not trying to understand. So can you just answer the big question of why did we talk about Afghanistan today? What's the purpose? I mean, I know it's our longest war of 20 years, and we're coming up to September 11th again, but why are you and I doing this, and what does it mean? What should we be doing different when we talk in the next couple of months about other topics? How should we be viewing ourselves in the world? That's your big question. Answer it however you wish.
I think that you're correct that anybody with, we're all sitting here with an internet connection. We can all Google facts. But what the world is really missing now is a commitment to editorial comment and proper historical context, because I always like this little I don't know if this came from church or where I heard this, but text without context is a pretext for your own prejudices. And in a theological sense, you've created God in your own image when he hates all the same people you do. You have access to facts. And if you go looking for facts with your own ideological lens, you will always find what you're looking for, because that is how the internet is designed to give you information. And what is lacking is context. Yes, if I go looking for facts, I will find them. But what I hope to provide is a broader context for the stuff that's happening, so that it doesn't become just a pretext for what you already believed.
Love it. Thank you, Professor. So, friends,